This is the Retro XP Podcast, a podcast dedicated to retro video games from the first and second gen with the Odyssey and the Atari 2600 all the way up to Gen 7 with the Xbox 360 and the PS3. On today's episode, I'll be talking about the Nintendo Entertainment System. I could say that this is like a part 2 of the 1983 video game crash episode I did. If you haven't listened to that, that's a pretty good episode. I did a lot of research on that one. And a very interesting story into the insight as to what was going on during that time. Because honestly, one could argue that the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, as I'll call it in this episode, brought the video game world back into the limelight during this crash. I'll talk about its development hardware, lifespan, games, and share some memories too with one of the most important video game systems ever to have come out. All right, let's get going. Retro XP is part of the Hair of the Dogcast network, so be sure to check out patreon.com/hairofthedogcast to check out every show the network has and get access to the exclusive community Discord. There's a 30-day free trial available if you want to try it out. Otherwise, you can follow me on X, Threads, Instagram, and YouTube at RetroXPodcast. Whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on, be sure to follow and enable notifications so you can find out when I drop a new episode. So let's paint the scene for you. It's 1983, and the world right now, at this time, is experiencing the video game crash. Of course, no one really knew it at the time except publishers, developers, retail stores, and arcade owners even. Customers are just sick of buying crappy games. They're spending all this money and, not knowing if the game's good or not, but just, hey, let's give it a shot and just blowing money. And retailers are having stocks and stocks of games that they just can't sell. And the likes of companies like Atari are shelling out this crap, and it's driving away gamers in droves. So here comes Nintendo, a card gaming company, interestingly enough. And the history of Nintendo goes way back to the 19th century, actually. It began when craftsman Fusajiro Yamauchi founded the company to produce handmade Hanafuda playing cards. And this was during the Meiji Restoration period of 1885, and gambling laws were relaxed a little bit in Japan. And Hanafuda cards, which were previously banned, all of a sudden became legal. Fusajiro, after having opening other shops selling lime in Kyoto, was inspired by both the booming business of Hanafuda and his personal taste for the game. He played it regularly at the time and decided to use his skills as a craft person to open a factory building these handmade Hanafuda decks. And I tried looking up how to play Hanafuda. I mean, it looks like just a generic like 40 card game, so to speak. But man, I couldn't even begin to understand it fully for this episode, much less even try to explain it. So we're just gonna pass on that. So on September 23rd, 1889. Fusajiro Yamauchi opened Yamauchi Fusajiro Shoten, also known as Yamauchi Nintendo, at the location of an unoccupied house he had purchased. After venturing into various lines of business and becoming a public company throughout the decades, Nintendo began producing toys in the 1960s and then later video games. Nintendo developed its first arcade games in the 1970s. And at this time also distributed its first system, the Color TV game, in 1977. The company became internationally dominant in the 1980s after the arcade release of, as we know, Donkey Kong, 1981, celebrating its 45th year anniversary. So happy birthday, Donkey Kong. You and I share the same birth year. I'm old. Anyway, during this time, in the early 1980s, several video game consoles proliferated in the United States, as well as low-quality games produced by third-party developers, which oversaturated the market, led to the video game crash in 1983. Like I said, if you want more info on how this whole thing panned out, it's kind of like the writing was on the wall for a long time and no one saw it coming, but people should have seen it coming. Check out my previous video on the video game crash. Consequently, a recession hit the American video game industry at this time, whose revenues went from over $3 billion from 1 year to $100 million between 1983 and 1985. That is a huge drop, well over 50%. I would argue 60, 70? Trying to math. I can't math. Japan was doing fine at this time, of course, having a tiger market against low-quality third-party games and arcades. So they had more strict rules and regulations on crap, so to speak. In 1978, Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi split Nintendo into separate research and development divisions. He appointed Masayuki Uemura as head of Nintendo Research and Development 2, which I think NRD is still around to this day. Yamauchi, through extensive discussions with Uemura and other engineers, recognized the potential of the developing console beyond gaming. He envisioned kind of like this home computer system disguised as a toy, which could significantly expand Nintendo's reach if it became popular with children. And this popularity would drive demand for games, with Nintendo being the sole provider. So video games were supposed to be initially dominated by just this one company, Nintendo. So interesting take at the start. Yamauchi tasked Uemura with developing a system that would be superior to its competitors and difficult to replicate. Of course, his main challenge also was economic rather than technological. Yamauchi wanted the system to be affordable enough for widespread household adoption, aiming for a price of 9,800 yen, which at the time was less than $75 American, compared to existing machines that was happening at the time, which were being priced at 30,000 yen, which was around $200 American. So you had to, like a lot of Atari systems and ColecoVisions and stuff were going for $200. So Nintendo wanted to be half that. The new system had to outperform other systems, both Japanese and American, while being significantly more affordable. Like I said, this was a lot to ask for, to make your system more powerful and also cheaper. That's a tough call. So let's see. Obviously we all know what happens. They nailed it. So Yamauchi ultimately instructed Uemura to prioritize simplicity and affordability, omitting these peripherals entirely. Game cartridges, which Uemura saw as less intimidating to consumers, were chosen as the format. The team designed the system with 2,000 bytes of random access memory. Now, for comparison, the PlayStation 5 right now has 16 gigabytes of RAM, which 2,000 bytes is 0.000002 gigabytes. It's pretty impressive, the technological leap we've seen over the last 40 years. The console's hardware was largely based on arcade video games, particularly the hardware for Namco's Galaxian and Nintendo's own Donkey Kong, with the goal of matching their powerful sprite and scrolling capabilities in a home system. So instead of having to want to go to the arcades all the time to play these same video games, just buy the home console and play it whenever you want. A test model was constructed in October of 1982 to verify the functionality of the hardware, and work began on programming tools. During development, Yamauchi directed engineers to reduce costs by removing non-essential components. Strip it down as bare as you can possibly make it. However, he insisted on including a low-cost circuit and connector that allowed the CPU to send or receive unmodified signals, enabling future hardware expansions such as modems or keyboards. Now, none of us knew what a modem was at this time. Of course, the internet was kind of around in its infancy at the time, but just none of us had access to it. This built-in capability led some within Nintendo to refer to the console as Yamauchi's Trojan horse. It's a basic system that has the potential to do so many things on the inside. It entered homes as a simple gaming device with two controllers, yet contained features far beyond its apparent function. And we see this kind of thing with future systems like the Super Nintendo with an expansion port. I think even like the Nintendo 64 with that expansion slot as well. GameCube as well. We saw kind of more functionality that the system could do. In 1989, a corporate report later acknowledged, in the initial stages of the system's development, we foresaw these possibilities. We built a data communications function into the system. So the idea in the beginning was Nintendo wanted to go online with this system. They wanted to have modem functionality to be able to connect online. For what it was capable of doing, I don't know. I highly doubt you could have downloaded games or anything like that, but probably there was some multiplayer functionality that they could have. I mean, can you imagine at this time in the 80s if the internet was, well, accessible, playing Super Mario Brothers with your friends over a modem connection? Crazy. Original plans called for the system's cartridges to be the size of a cassette tape. Cassette tape isn't very big. If you don't know what a cassette tape looks like, if for some reason you're under 30, Google it. But they ultimately ended up being twice as large. Careful design attention was paid to the cartridge connectors, as loose and faulty connections often plagued the arcade machines. Because it can never say this word, necessitated. I have to always slow down when I say necessitated 60 connection lines for the memory and expansion. Nintendo decided to produce its own connectors. So each cartridge typically contained 2 primary chips, one for the game's program code and another for graphical data used to render on-screen characters. Nintendo's R&D 3 team designed the UNROM cartridge, which enabled larger memory capacities and the use of bank switching. The technique involved storing additional data in RAM and dynamically accessing it as needed, thereby significantly expanding gameplay possibilities. Gunpei Yokei, who's one of the lead engineers of the NES, suggested a cartridge eject lever be added, not really for functionality, but just to amuse children. And as a child, when I had my NES, this was pretty cool. I mean, to put the cartridge in and just slide it down. It didn't need to do that. It was just fun to do. I got. So the code name for the project at the time was Gamecom or Pasocon, but Masayuki Uemura's wife proposed the name Famicom, arguing that in Japan, Pasocon is used to mean a personal computer. But really, this wasn't a home or a personal computer. She said perhaps we could say it's a family computer. And I would say she was right on that one. Meanwhile, Yamauchi decided that the console should use a red and white color scheme after seeing a hoarding for a DX antenna. It's a Japanese antenna manufacturer that used these colors. So he saw an antenna and he was like, that's a good color scheme. Sure, you never know. On July 15th, 1983, the console was released in Japan as the home cassette-type video game, the Family Computer, or the Famicom. This was priced at 14,800 yen, or $94. By that number, it's $128, with 3 launch games, Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Popeye. Despite it being more money than they originally wanted to charge customers, it was still significantly cheaper than the competition. The hardware, what was under the hood, like I said, this is for the hardware nerds. The CPU was a Ryko 2A03, which was clocking in at 1.79 megahertz, 2 kilobytes working RAM and 2 kilobytes video RAM, 256 bytes sprite RAM, and its display output was 256 by 240 pixels. Graphics were powered by a Ryko 2C02, and its sound was delivered by an APU 5-channel 2-pulse wave white noise DPCM system. I don't know what any of that means, but if you do, I'm happy for you. It was backed at the time by a pretty robust marketing campaign. 500,000 units were sold within the first 2 months. However, at this time, and this is something I learned through all my research, actually, I didn't know that this happened. A major fault emerged ahead of the critical Japanese New Year season as reports began surfacing of consoles crashing during gameplay. Uemura and engineer Gunpei Yokoi traced the issue to a defective integrated circuit that could lock under specific data conditions. So upon reporting the issue to Yamauchi, a lot of the staff proposed selectively replacing affected units. So not replacing all of them, but just handpicking some. I don't know how they thought about going about doing that. But however, Nintendo was warned that a partial response could damage consumer trust and jeopardize Nintendo's first mover advantage before competitors could respond. So I mean, you can only imagine, like if Nintendo decided to not go full on in. So Yamauchi considered both sides and issued a decisive directive. Recall them all. Kind of similar to what we saw with Microsoft 360, where they were like pretty selective in the beginning, and then they decided, you know what, we don't want to erode customers' trust. let's just replace them all. Send your defective system to us. We'll give you a new one, either refurbished or a brand new one. So after a product recall and the release of a revised model with a new motherboard without the issues present, the system's popularity then soared. By the end of 1984, the Famicom had become the best-selling game console in Japan and what came to be called the Famicom boom. Now, at this time, Nintendo was planning the NES to be released into the American market through a distribution agreement with Atari at the time, interestingly enough. The agreement was expected to be finalized at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show in June of 1983. However, during the show, Atari discovered that Coleco was demonstrating an unlicensed port of Nintendo's Donkey Kong on its Atom computer system. Atari was pretty petty at this time and thought this was a breach of contract because Atari wanted exclusivity in having Donkey Kong on their systems that they were going to be distributing. Atari believed that this violated its exclusive license for the game Donkey Kong and delayed the deal as a result. Shortly afterward, Atari CEO Ray Kassar was fired. The deal eventually fell apart, and Nintendo decided to market its system on its own. It's crazy reading these stories and reading these close calls, I would say, because we were so close to having Atari maybe not even being a running joke within the video game industry right now. We're talking about Atari potentially distributing a Nintendo Entertainment System in America and maybe poising itself to be a bigger player at the game and not having crashed at this time. Very interesting. Very interesting. So, well, I mean, it didn't work out for Atari in the end here. Nintendo believed that the Famicom name might not resonate with American consumers. I think I would kind of agree with that. And initially rebranded the console as the Advanced Video System. Much better. Right. The AVS resembled a home computer rather than a toy. And it featured a built-in keyboard, a cassette-based data drive, and infrared wireless controllers. Yeah, that would have been an interesting design choice. I saw a picture of this, and because I've never seen it before, I saw a picture of the initial prototype, and I'm like, it kind of reminded me a little bit like a, Commodore 64 type of design. Which, if you're trying to, at this time, the marketing was trying to market these systems as home computers. So, and when you think of computers, you think of keyboards, you think of wireless connectivity and all this stuff. So they were trying to design it to be like home computers. But obviously they only played video games. You couldn't actually use them as computers. So the AVS was publicly demonstrated at the Winter CES, Consumer Electronics Show, in January of 1985. But the reaction was pretty lukewarm. While the hardware and games were praised, there was still deep skepticism that the console could succeed in the United States, as the industry here was still recovering from the video game crash in 1983. Electronic Games magazine reported in March 1985 that the video game market in America had all but virtually disappeared and believed it could be a miscalculation on Nintendo's part. So imagine if they took that advice there. Imagine if they said, well, maybe we shouldn't do this. So yeah, so many little so many little moments that it could have, steered everything the wrong way. To test the waters of a resurgence in home video games, Nintendo launched the Versus system, or VS system, an arcade conversion system that featured ports of select Famicom games with a focus on two-player competitive play. So the first Mario Brothers game we saw in arcade form was kind of like a two-player co-op competitive game. The Versus system became a major success, selling nearly 100,000 cabinets in the Americas and becoming the highest-grossing arcade machine of 1985 in the United States. This success gave Nintendo a little bit of confidence to pursue a home console launch in America and provided a platform to test new titles to help shape the launch lineup. And I would say having your system's graphics and gameplay be on par with these arcade games is what brought people in, because, like I said earlier, why have a home system with less inferior graphics and then go to the arcades and have it be far superior? Or even, a counterpoint, like, why should I go to the arcade and dump a bunch of quarters every day when I could just invest in a home system and just stay at home and play? So At this time, Nintendo of America designers Lance Barr and Don James were disappointed with the prototype console that they received from Japan, which they nicknamed the Lunchbox. It just looks like a literal lunchbox, I guess. I was trying to Google pictures to see what this looked like, and I really didn't find anything that definitively looked like it. So I got to assume it just, like I said, looks like a old school lunchbox. The Famicom home computer was designed with a top loader for the cartridges and hardwired controllers to the system that had pretty short cords. So if you look at the Famicom, that what we got in Japan, far different than what the NES looks like to our standards. The cords themselves, like you could actually like seat them into the system itself, which was kind of nice. But like I said, in order to play, the controller's cords weren't detachable. They were hardwired into the system. So you couldn't just take the controller out, so to speak. For the console's Western redesign, they added a two-tone gray color scheme with a black stripe and red lettering, as well as a front-loading zero insertion force slot modeled after a video cassette recorder, which concealed the game cartridge once inserted. The little flap door flapped closed, and you didn't even need to see the cartridge itself. The redesigned console, which was now called the Nintendo Entertainment System, was unveiled by Nintendo at the June 1985 Summer CES and dropped the home computer features of the earlier AVS prototype fully, while retaining that same gray color scheme and boxy form factor. It also replaced the Famicom's hardwired controllers, like I talked about earlier, and the AVS's wireless ones with detachable wired controllers using their own proprietary 7-pin connectors. To avoid the language used by earlier game consoles, marketing manager Gal Tilden at this time coined alternative terms for the NES's hardware, calling the cartridges game packs, and the console itself the control deck, which will later aid in its acceptance in toy stores. So not calling it a computer per se, a control deck, game packs. Kind of cool. To further distance itself from previous consoles, Nintendo heavily promoted optional accessories, such as the Zapper light gun, the robotic operating buddy, or ROB, to position the system as cutting edge and sophisticated. While initial consumer interest in the console was limited, its peripherals actually drew significant attention. Imagine like having a robot play a video game with you. Kind of neat, I guess. I never used the ROB before. I mean, I've seen it countless times everywhere, but I've never used it myself. Never had I don't know, maybe one day I'll have it in my collection. We'll see. The NES launched in a limited test market in New York City on October 18th, 1985. Followed by Los Angeles the next year in February 1986, and then finally, full North American release on September 27th, 1986. The launch lineup included 17 games: 10-Yard Fight, Baseball, Clue Clue Land, Duck Hunt, Excite Bike, Golf, Gyromite, Hogan's Alley, Ice Climber, Kung Fu, Pinball, Soccer, Stack Up, Super Mario Brothers, Tennis, Wild Gunman, and Wrecking Crew. Nintendo contracted with toy company Worlds of Wonder at this time to get the NES distributed in stores. You couldn't just go out and buy this anywhere. You had to go to, specific places where WoW games were being sold. Their aggressive sales tactics, which included requiring retailers to carry the NES in order to sell WoW's other popular toys, helped secure shelf space for the console. WoW salesman Jim Wims distinctly recalled delivering an ultimatum to a lot of these stores. And he said, quote, "If you want to sell Teddy Ruxpin and you want to sell laser tag, you're gonna sell Nintendo as well." Damn. WoW's efforts led to a successful first year for the NES. I would put that lightly. Afterwards, Nintendo of America ended the distribution deal and hired WoW's sales team as their own, taking over distribution directly. Kind of neat. So a little bit after, at this time, Europe and Oceania countries were getting they were getting their own versions of it. So mainland Europe, excluding Italy, where distribution was handled by several different companies, Nintendo pretty much responsible for their own manufacturing. The NES saw an early launch in Europe in 1986, although most European countries received the console in 1987. In Scandinavia, it was released on September 1st, 1986. In the Netherlands, it was released in the last quarter of 1987. France also released in October of 1987, and Spain in 1988. In 1987, Mattel handled distribution for the second region, which consisted of the United Kingdom, Ireland, Italy, Australia, and New Zealand. In other European countries, distribution was handled by smaller companies like B&N Grabber in Germany, ASD in France, Concentra Portugal, so on and so forth. So Poland got the NES in October 6, 1994. Poland was in the Soviet bloc at this time, kind of. So I would wager that was probably a reason why they got it so late. And they got it alongside the SNES and the Game Boy. Wild. In November 1994, Nintendo signed an agreement with Steepler, distribution company at the time, to permit the continued sale of the Dendy, an unauthorized hardware clone of the Famicom, in Russia, in exchange for also distributing the SNES. Now, interestingly enough, in Brazil, the console was officially released in 1993 by Playtronic. However, the Brazilian market had been dominated by unlicensed NES clones, which is a common theme in Brazil. So many unauthorized systems that, leading all the way up to probably now, with modern systems, that were either, these NES clones were either locally made or smuggled in from Taiwan. One of the most successful Brazilian NES clones was the Phantom system, which licensed Nintendo products in the country for the following decade. The sales of officially licensed products in the region were low due to the abundance of these clones, so it was no point for Nintendo to come out and say, hey, buy the official Nintendo product. And it's like, well, these unlicensed clones that can do the same thing cost half the price. They're going to go with that. So the console's official launch came a little bit after the SNES. So at this time, the NES was released in several retail bundles through its commercial life. For 1985 American test launch, the initial offering was the full-on deluxe set, which retailed for $179 at the time. In today's numbers, that's $540. This included the control deck, 2 controllers, the NES Zapper light gun, the Rob robotic accessory, and 2 game packs, Gyromite and Duck Hunt. Ahead of the console's nationwide launch in 1986, Nintendo introduced a basic control tech set with 2 controllers bundled with Super Mario Bros. For $99. Right now, that's $280. In 1988, the deluxe set was replaced by the action set, which retailed for $100 and bundled with the control deck was 2 controllers, the NES Zapper, and a dual game pack containing Super Mario Bros. And Duck Hunt. This was the one I got when I was a kid for my birthday, which I'll talk about later. In October 1993, Nintendo released a redesigned version of the console, known as the New Style NES, or NES 101, in North America, Australia, and Japan. And this version included a single redesigned dog bone-shaped controller, a top-loading cartridge slot, and much better pin connectors. And if you had a Nintendo system growing up, you know about how those pin connectors were pretty poor, which I'll explain a little bit of the reason why. But for some reason at the time, we felt like we all had to blow into the cartridges before putting them into the slot because maybe dust was in there, preventing the systems from booting up. And tell me that doesn't work. I dare you. I dare you to tell me that doesn't work. Even though I know Nintendo debunked that for the longest time, but I still do it. This retailed for $50 at the time in North America before its discontinuation 2 years later. Crazy. August 14th, 1995, Nintendo discontinued the Nintendo Entertainment System in both North America and Europe. In North America, replacements for the original front-loading NES were available for $25 in exchange for a broken system until at least December 1996 under Nintendo's Power Swap program. I think my Nintendo at the time was fine. I didn't have any issues, but I don't recall this being a thing. I mean, obviously, because my Nintendo was working just fine. In September 2003, Nintendo discontinued the Famicom in Japan. Damn, so long. Alongside the Super Famicom and disc rewriting services for the Famicom Disk System, which was an attachment for the original Famicom. The last Famicom model, serial number HN11033309, was manufactured on September 25th, 2003. Nintendo offered repair services for the Famicom in Japan until 2007, when it was discontinued due to a shortage of available parts. Total sales in North America hovered around 34 million units sold. 34 million units sold, which accounted for half of the worldwide sales, which was around 62 million. And it ranks as the 14th best-selling console of all time. And not surprisingly, the best-selling game of all time, Super Mario Bros., with over 40 million copies sold. Now, what made the NES stand out the most was a lesson learned from the 1983 video game crash, the 10 NES lockout chip, which prevents the console from running cartridges unapproved by Nintendo. Nintendo sought to use the lockout chip to restrict games to only those licensed for the system. This means of protection worked in combination with Nintendo's seal of quality, quote, which a developer had to acquire before they would be able to have access to the required 10 NES information prior to publication of the game. Original NES consoles sold in different regions have different lockout chips, thereby enforcing regional lockout regardless of TV signal compatibility, so you couldn't buy Japanese games and play them on your American NESs. Such regions include North America, most of continental Europe, which they called PAL B, Asia and the British Isles, Italy, and Australasia, PAL A. Problems with the 10 NES lockout chip frequently result in one of the console's most common issues, the blinking red power light, in which the system appears to turn itself on and off repeatedly because the 10 NES chip would reset the console once per second. The lockout chip requires constant communication with the chip in order for the game to work. So this was kind of what confused us, is that it's not creating a connection. So this is why blowing in the cartridge helped make it work. I don't know how, black magic, but it worked. Nintendo was not as restrictive as Sega, though, which is interesting. Nintendo did not permit third-party publishers until Mediagenic in late summer 1988. Nintendo's intention, as noble as it could be, Nintendo's intention was to reserve a large part of NES game revenue for itself, and the company required that it be the sole manufacturer of all cartridges, and that the publisher had to pay in full, before the cartridges for that game could even be produced. And I say as noble as can be because they were sticklers for quality. They wanted games to come out on their system to be of the highest quality, like I said earlier, having that seal of quality sticker on the cartridge, because bad games make a bad system. Full stop. So cartridges could not even be returned to Nintendo if you didn't sell it, so publishers assumed all the risk. As a result, some publishers lost more money due to distressed sales of remaining inventory at the end of the NES era than they ever earned in profits from sales of the games. So it's like you could either sit on this stock or sell it at a loss. Because Nintendo controlled the production of all cartridges, it was able to enforce strict rules on its third-party developers who were required to sign a contract that would obligate them to develop exclusively for the system, order at least 10,000 cartridges, and only make 5 games per year. Doesn't matter what they were. 5 games per year. The global 1988 shortage of DRAM and ROM chips reportedly caused Nintendo to only permit an average of 25% of publishers' requests for cartridges, with some receiving much higher amounts and others just receiving almost none. I don't know how they chose that, but they did. Some developers tried to circumvent the 5-game limit by creating additional company brands. Most notably, Konami created the Ultra Games label. Others tried to circumvent the 10 NES chip themselves. And like I said, due to these strict licensing agreements, Nintendo was actually accused of antitrust violations because of this chip, because of this tight market control. The United States Department of Justice and several states began probing the company's business practices, leading to the involvement of Congress and the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. Damn, you got the U.S. government coming after you, Nintendo. The FTC conducted an extensive investigation, which included interviewing hundreds of retailers. During the FTC probe, of course, this was at the time when no one knew what the hell a video game was. During the FTC probe, Nintendo changed the terms of its publisher licensing agreements to eliminate the 2-year rule and so many other restrictive terms. Nintendo and the FTC settled the case in April 1991, with Nintendo being required to send vouchers, giving a $5 discount off to a new game to every person that had purchased an NES game between June 1988 and December 1990. This initial mistrust of major third-party publishers and developers continued to erode throughout the years as other companies like Sony, Sega, and Microsoft just having much better relations with these publishers than Nintendo. Something we still see to this day. I think when these companies started to see what was happening with Nintendo and how they were having such a crazy lock on their games, they were like, well, we got opportunities that we could take advantage of here. And these third-party publishers were more than happy to jump ship. They didn't need Nintendo at this time like Nintendo thought they did. Of course, there were also companies that managed to circumvent the 10-pin lockout chip, like I talked about earlier. Atari, Tengen, and Christian video game developer Color Dreams. That's why sometimes if you see old Nintendo games, you see weird-looking cartridges. Like the Tengen cart is kind of black in shape. A lot of these Christian video games are kind of baby blue and pink or whatever. So they work on old school Nintendos, but they weren't technically licensed as such. I would say the Christian video game developer, I mean, Nintendo went after Tengen and Atari like they do, but going after a religious Christian video game developer for Nintendo, probably not a bad look, or probably would be a bad look, I would say. So they were like, we're not gonna die on this hill. One other interesting caveat, actually, as if Nintendo wasn't already setting itself as a petty video game company, was its attack on video game rentals. Some small video game rental shops began buying their own copies of NES games and just renting them out to customers for around the same price as you would rent a VHS tape for a few days. Nintendo received no profit from this practice, poor Nintendo, beyond the initial cost of their game. Unlike movie rentals, a newly released game could circulate and be available for rent on the same day. Nintendo took steps to stop game rentals, but did not take any formal legal action until Blockbuster Video began making a huge footprint in America at this time, being practically everywhere. So Nintendo claimed that allowing customers to rent games would significantly hurt sales and drive up the cost of games. Oh, Nintendo notably lost the lawsuit, but did win on a claim of copyright infringement. Blockbuster was banned from including photocopies of original copyrighted instruction booklets with its rented games. In compliance with the ruling, Blockbuster printed its own short instructions, usually in the form of a small booklet, card, or label on the back of the rental box, which explained a game's basic premise and controls. I remember this. This was very interesting because it was like, I mean, having a book was kind of cool, like the official book, but also this is how you learn to play the game. NES games didn't really have much of tutorial sections, if at all. So you learned how to play the game by reading the book. And I do remember at one point I rented Little Nemo and the Dream Master, and there were certain things I didn't know how to do because I didn't have access to the book. I had to rent it. And I had to call the Nintendo helpline because I was like, it's telling me to do something, but I also don't know how to do it. So, yeah, interesting. So I wasted probably $4 of my parents' money to just call this helpline. Thankfully, it was a short phone call. Anyway, throughout its lifespan, it had so many cool accessories and peripherals. The original controller, as you know, has a rectangular shape with sharp edges. It's if you hold it for a long time, occasionally you'll get you're not going to get cut, but you're going to get some pretty decent indents on your hand, depending on how well or how hard you hold your controller. I had this really nice D-pad on the left, 2 red buttons on the right labeled B and A. 2 smaller buttons in the middle were labeled Start and Select. Start usually gave you the ability to pause your game mid-play, access options in some cases. Select really didn't do much of anything. Maybe got you to, go through the initial title screens and stuff, but not much during the game. Later on, we got the NES Max controller that was shaped almost like kind of like how we see modern game controllers nowadays with like kind of like grips. Almost looks like a thick boomerang too, with the D-pad replaced with like this touchpad like controller. It's like a joystick controller where it's like touch sensitive, and the same button configurations as the original controller, but now with these like turbo options. The turbo options rapidly press the button you select without you having to tap it uncontrollably. For the new style NES, we got a dog bone controller that smoothed out the edges of the original controller into like a dog bone shape, so to speak. For the hardcore, we got the NES Advantage, which was an arcade stick-like controller. You could sit on your lap. It had this like really beefy like metal plate on the bottom. I would beat this thing quite often when I would get mad and frustrated, and it still holds up. Still holds up. I think I still have it. I think I kept my original one, and still works to this day. It had a ball top joystick instead of a D-pad and the same button configurations as the other controllers, along with turbo functionality like the Max did. The additional feature that this one had is that with each turbo button, it had a knob that allowed you to control the speed of the turbo. It also had a slow button, which just rapidly hit the pause button for you to see attacks thrown at you easier. It also had 2 controller ports. And then a switch that goes from player 1 to player 2. So like, say for example, you're playing Super Mario Brothers, and you first start out playing as Mario, then you die, and then you play as Luigi. You can use the same controller. You just flick over to player 2. It's like a switch, player 1, player 2. You flick over to player 2, and you play as player 2 right away. So kind of neat. You plug in both ports into player 1 and player 2 in the front of the screen. So this slow button that I talked about earlier worked well in Mega Man 1 with Elecman's attack. If you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. The NES Zapper was a light gun that you could point to the screen and shoot enemies with, only on certain games, obviously, like Hogan's Alley, Duck Hunt, Operation Wolf, so on. The Rob, which I talked about earlier, was a robot peripheral that you needed to have face the screen, the CRT TV, and its eyes responded to flashes on the screen. It only worked with 2 games, Gyromite and Stack Up. In typical fashion with Nintendo, and it's a trend we see even to this day, Nintendo has these shticks where they market these things as like revolutionary. This is so cool. This is so unique. No one else has this. But they don't support it long term. So we got this really cool robotic operating buddy that only worked with 2 games. It was pretty much useless for the rest of the Nintendo's lifespan. We also got this like kind of like dance pad, like pad, I guess, like a floor mat almost, called the Power Pad, which had 12 buttons on the pad, and you had to stomp on them with your feet, kind of like regular buttons, so to speak. And this worked with 11 games worldwide. Not everything was American, but this included games like Athletic World, Stadium Events. Yes, Stadium Events, the same one that cost $19,000 loose. I'm not even going to tell you how much of $50,000, I think, complete in box. Dance, acrobatics, and more. So, how about the games? I mean, we could talk about like the top 10 highest selling games of all time for the NES, top to bottom. Super Mario Brothers with 40 million sold. Duck Hunt with 28 million. Super Mario Brothers 3 with 18 million. Tetris with 8 million. Super Mario Brothers 2, 7.6 million. The Legend of Zelda with 6.5 million. Dr. Mario, 4.8 million. Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, 4.3 million. Excite Bike with 4.1 million. And Golf with flat 4 million copies sold. However, these aren't really the most important games to talk about from this system. Nintendo spawns some of the most influential franchises in video game history, starting with the NES, and many of which we still see in development to this day. Besides Super Mario Brothers, of course, Legend of Zelda, both of them are locked exclusively to the Nintendo hardware. We got another exclusive franchise like Metroid that got locked onto the Nintendo hardware and made its debut on the NES. It was a mature, side-scrolling, non-linear sci-fi action game, kind of, defined a genre of video games, I would say. Other notable franchises that have since branched out from Nintendo's umbrella are Mega Man, Castlevania, Contra, Dragon's Quest, or Dragon Warrior here in the US for at least a couple centuries after this, Final Fantasy, Ninja Gaiden, Metal Gear, and just so many more. It really would be tough to just name everything, and I'd have to make a whole nother episode on the games themselves. So if that's an episode you want to hear about or you want me to go through, definitely let me know. Comment on these episodes, comment on my social medias. Let me know if that's something that you want me to talk about. But it's without a doubt that the NES brought us some of the most influential video games of our time, even to this day. Now, when I was 7, I remember I was 7 at the time, and I was going to be 7. I had a friend up the block from me, had something pretty cool in his house. He said it was a Nintendo system. I didn't know what the hell a Nintendo system was at this time. At this time in the early and mid 80s, like I said, when I grew up, we were outdoor latchkey kids. We ran outside, wandered our neighborhoods from friends' houses to friends' houses, parks, street corners, and wherever we could play. We didn't have constant connections with our parents at this time, so it was like parents were like, go out and play, and then it's like they didn't see you for hours, probably. They would basically tell you, like, be back by this time, and you had a watch on your wrist to tell you that, or be back when the streetlights come on, or be back. Lunch is going to be served at this time. Dinner's going to be served at this time. So, we had more freedom at this time, and I'm not here to give parenting lessons on, whether that was good or bad, because I'm not a parent myself, and honestly, I think that shaped who we were because it gave us a little bit more independence. But anyway, my friend at this time, Nick, told me about this TV system that he had. He plugs it into his TV, and he was hooked with it. He couldn't stop talking about it. And at this time, he invited me over, and the first game I laid my eyes on was Super Mario Brothers. Man, I was hooked too at the same time as him. It was so bad in some cases that I'd be over at his house and we would just be playing this game, and my mom would just call up Nick's mom, telling her, like, send my son home. I'm sorry. Like, he shouldn't be doing this, whatever. Oh, she was almost embarrassed at the time. I was taking up so much time. And I just remember, like, my mom tells me these stories to this day. And she was like, I was so embarrassed that you were over there, just like, almost freeloading, just playing his Nintendo. And she, my mom would say, like, yeah, Nick's mom was so nice and supportive. She's like, it's fine, no big deal. Like, they're having fun, they're having a good time. And I want to say Nick's mom was probably happy that she was just like with had a friend or something like that. I think that's every mom's wish, is to have, their kids like have really good friends. And in hindsight, actually, maybe I was using my friend Nick a little bit to play his NES. But even still, we still hung out and played outside like every so often. It's not like I was like calling him up like, hey, can I come over and play your Nintendo system? Like, it wasn't like that at all. We were still friends. It was just, Nick had a bonus that made me want to hang out with him even more. It's like, maybe I could play the Nintendo system later. Honestly, playing outside was more fun. I was a kid that just enjoyed the outdoors a little bit more than just like being like stuck inside playing games all day. Even though nowadays it'd be more of a dream than anything. So fast forward to my 7th birthday at this time, I got the NES action set for my birthday. And because my mom was like, well, I guess this is going to keep you here more often than just like going to Nick's house and just using his system, so to speak. So my mom just didn't want to fight it anymore. And this day I was the happiest kid in my old neighborhood. I was drawn into Super Mario Brothers right away because I got Super Mario Brothers and Duck Hunt. And I had fun with Duck Hunt, and my dad at this time wasn't much. Obviously, he didn't know what a video game was, but he saw this gun and he saw me shooting things on a screen. So he was like, I want to play that. The only time I ever saw my dad play a video game ever. It's something easy. Just shoot the ducks. That's it. Since my parents were still unnerved at me being cooped up inside all day, they gave me time limits to play, and they kicked me out of the house every so often, just go outside and play, like whether it was with friends or not. So we didn't buy games that often, and we made a weekly tradition every Friday night after school to go rent games. My mom and brother would rent a movie. I would rent a Nintendo game. Or, obviously as the years went by, when we had other systems, I would rent other games as well for other systems. And this is where I discovered some of my other favorite games, most notably the Mega Man games. Mega Man 2, Mega Man 1 was good. Mega Man 2 by far blew my expectations out of the water, cemented me as a Mega Man fan for life. Ninja Gaiden games as well. You can play as a ninja in this like high-paced action, mature storyline. In many cases, I would rent these games so much that my parents would just eventually buy me these games. So, give me a chance to rent other games. Because my mom would just be like, wait, didn't you rent this last week? So it's like, well, I guess I might as well just buy this game for you so you can rent other stuff. The Mega Man series was by far my favorite franchise on the NES, and with every game released, I just became even more hooked. The Ninja Gaiden games challenged my patience and fortitude. Castlevania brought horror into my living room. Contra brought hardcore action. And my dad eventually was happy to see me play Goal, a soccer game for the NES. My, Eastern European family, my dad especially, was happy to see soccer on the TV, at least in some form. And I wonder, even now, if 7-year-old me that, like, if he knew I'd be still gaming in my mid-40s. Back then, you don't think about the end. You don't think about, at some point I'm going to stop doing this. You're so invested in the here and now. At that time when you're a kid, that is like the best thing since sliced bread at the time. You don't think about like the existential dread of like, at some point I'm going to stop playing video games. And a lot of friends I grew up with did stop. We played games when we were younger, and then when they got older, they moved on to other things. But for me, as all know now, I'm still playing. I'm playing new. I'm playing old. I'm playing everything. So the NES is a legacy in and of itself. And as I stated, it's one of the most, if not the most, important video game console in history. It's subjective almost to a certain point, but I firmly believe that. It turned around the video game crash. It brought quality back into video games, despite a lot of moves that maybe were anti-consumer from Nintendo, but they were a stickler for quality, and they held firm to that. And this even influenced competitors to pick up their game, quite literally, like Sega and Atari, both not really successful in the long term, and brought newcomers into the field like Sony, Microsoft, and even like the PC game market. Making it affordable and family-friendly was the way to go, and soon established Nintendo as a household name that everyone recognized. Even if you didn't have one in your house, your family knew what Nintendo meant. So that about wraps things up in this episode. So be sure to follow me on my socials, X, Threads, Instagram, and YouTube at RetroXPodcast, whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. Be sure to follow and enable notifications so you can find out when I drop a new episode. I also want to thank Hair of the Dogcast Network for allowing me in their group of shows, and consider contributing to us on Patreon at patreon.com/hairofthedogcast and join the community where you can get access and early access exclusive episodes every week. Thanks for listening.